The first premise in Matheny's argument is the principle of equal consideration of interests. We are pretty familiar with this principle at this point in the semester, but basically the principle states that if a being has interests, then those interests deserve equal consideration. If a being has interests or possesses interests, then those interests deserve to be equally considered relative to other interests. So in other words, this principle is saying that if a being, whatever that being may be, has an interest in, say, not being caused harm, not suffering or experiencing pain, or if a being has an interest in food and water, basic nutrition, then those interests must be taken into consideration when making decisions about how one ought morally to act. This principle also entails the idea that just because your interests are your own, that does not mean that they matter more than the next being's interests. Each being's interests deserve equal consideration, okay? That is to say that your interests, your individual, your own personal interests, they may matter more to you subjectively, to you as your own subject. But in the objective sense, objectively, your interests do not matter more than mine, and my interests do not matter more than the next being's, etc. Okay? If that being has similar interests, then those interests deserve equal consideration. Notice, and I want to point this out right from the start, this principle does entail that wherever there are equal interests, there ought to also be equal treatment, right? So if you and I, for example, each have an interest in freedom of speech, then we ought to both be treated equally when it comes to freedom of speech. I shouldn't get more freedom of speech than you if we both have an equal interest in that item. But if there are different interests, okay, if you have an interest that I don't, then that could reasonably result in different treatment. So for example, as a male, I do not have an interest in a safe pregnancy. That just doesn't apply to me. But if you're a female, you may have an interest in a safe pregnancy. And so equal moral consideration would say, okay, we're considering the interests of Sean, a male, and this other female. And when we equally consider their interests, we see that Sean lacks an interest that the female has. And because there are different interests, equal moral consideration actually results in different treatment. You don't need to give me the means to a safe pregnancy, but you would have to provide that to a female, okay? So I'm just trying to point out that when there are equal interests, that warrants and deserves equal treatment. But if there are unequal interests or even slightly different interests, then those different interests still deserve equal moral consideration, but they may not deserve the exact same treatment as a result. That could still be reasonable and justified. So this principle is the first premise in Matheny's argument, and he will use it to lead into and make a logical connection with the moral theory of utilitarianism.